The crack of a rifle echoed through the canyon as Beckett Morgan ducked behind a boulder, cursing his luck and the scorching Arizona sun of 1875. At 30 years old, he'd seen his share of trouble, but the band of outlaws pursuing him for the past 3 days was testing even his considerable patience. Beckett touched the weathered brim of his Stetson, peering cautiously around the edge of his rocky shelter as dust billowed from where the bullet had struck. "Damn it all," he muttered, checking the ammunition in his Colt. 3 bullets left. He'd have to make them count. Beckett had been riding back to his modest ranch after delivering a herd of cattle to Tucson when he'd stumbled upon the outlaws' camp. He'd meant to pass by quietly, but his horse had whinnied, and they'd given chase. Now, 3 days later, he was separated from his mount, low on supplies, and trapped in a narrow canyon with at least 4 men hunting him. A second shot ricocheted off the rock above his head, showering him with fragments of stone. Beckett took a deep breath, steadying his hand. He couldn't stay pinned down forever. "I know you're out there, cowboy," a gravelly voice called out. "Ain't no way out of that canyon cept through us." Beckett remained silent, scanning his surroundings. The canyon walls rose steep on either side, but to his right, a narrow trail zigzagged upward. If he could reach higher ground, he might have a chance. Gathering his strength, Beckett fired a shot in the direction of the voice, then immediately sprinted toward the trail. Bullets kicked up dust at his heels as he scrambled up the rocky path, keeping low. His boots slipped on loose gravel, but adrenaline propelled him forward and upward. When he reached a small outcropping about 30 feet up, he pressed his back against the canyon wall, breathing hard. The outlaws were shouting to each other below, clearly debating whether to follow him up the treacherous path. Beckett used the moment to take stock of his situation. The trail continued upward, but about 50 yards ahead, it appeared to lead into some sort of opening in the canyon wall. A cave, perhaps. Shelter, at the very least. Moving carefully along the narrow ledge, Beckett made his way toward the dark opening. The sounds of pursuit had grown fainter. The outlaws had either given up or were searching for an easier route to follow him. Either way, he needed to find a defensible position before nightfall. As he approached the cave entrance, Beckett drew his Colt, alert for any sign of mountain lions or other predators that might have claimed the space. The opening was larger than it had appeared from a distance, easily tall enough for him to walk through without stooping. He paused at the threshold, allowing his eyes to adjust to the dimness. A soft sound from within the cave froze him in place, not an animal's growl, but something more startling, a human whimper. "Who's there?" Beckett called out, his voice echoing slightly off the stone walls. "I'm armed, so you'd best speak up." Silence answered him at first, then another small sound, the clinking of metal against stone. Beckett moved forward cautiously, squinting into the shadows. As his vision adapted to the low light filtering in from the entrance, he made out a figure huddled against the far wall of the small cave. A woman, her wrists and ankles bound with iron shackles. "Good Lord," Beckett breathed, holstering his gun and approaching slowly. "Miss, are you hurt?" The woman shrank back, her eyes wide with fear in a dirt-smudged face. Her dark hair hung in tangled waves around her shoulders, and her dress, once fine but now torn and filthy, suggested she wasn't from these parts. "I ain't gonna hurt you," Beckett said, crouching down a few feet away from her. "My name's Beckett Morgan. I've got some trouble on my tail, but I reckon yours might be worse. How'd you come to be here?" The woman stared at him, her gaze wary but assessing. Finally, she spoke, her voice hoarse from disuse or thirst. "Pearl," she said simply. "Pearl Finley." Beckett nodded, not pushing for more. He reached for his canteen, which still held a few precious swallows of water. "Here," he offered, holding it out to her. "Take it slow." Pearl hesitated, then reached for the canteen with shackled hands. The chains between her wrists clinked as she raised the container to her lips, drinking carefully as he'd advised. "Thank you," she whispered, handing it back. "How long you been here?" Beckett asked, surveying the heavy iron restraints. They were prison-grade shackles, but Pearl Finley didn't look like any criminal he'd ever encountered. 3 days, I think, she answered, her voice steadier now. They brought me here after taking me from the stagecoach to Santa Fe. The same men who are after me, Pearl nodded. Likely. 4 of them? Their leader is a man called Ryder, she shuddered. They attacked our coach, killed the driver and guard. There was an elderly couple traveling with me. Her voice faltered. You don't need to say more, Beckett said gently, but why'd they leave you here? Ryder said they'd come back for me after they sold the stolen goods in town, said he had plans for me. Pearl's chin lifted slightly, a spark of defiance showing through her fear. I've been trying to break free, but these shackles are solid. Beckett studied the chains thoughtfully. I might be able to help with that, but first we need to make sure those men don't find us. They're still down in the canyon looking for a way up. He moved to the cave entrance, peering out cautiously. The sun was beginning to set, painting the canyon walls in deep red and orange. No sign of the outlaws from this vantage point, but that didn't mean they'd given up. Returning to Pearl, Beckett examined her shackles more closely. The locks were sturdy but simple. My pa taught me a thing or two about locks, he explained, pulling a small leather pouch from his vest pocket. Inside were several thin metal tools, not quite proper lockpicks, but they'd served him well in the past when gates or padlocks needed opening. Let's see what we can do about these. Pearl watched intently as Beckett selected 2 of the small tools and began working on the lock of her wrist shackles. His large, calloused hands moved with surprising delicacy as he manipulated the mechanisms. Where are you from, Miss Finley? He asked, partly to distract her from his work and partly out of genuine curiosity. Boston, she replied. I was traveling to Santa Fe to take a teaching position at a new school there. Beckett glanced up at her. In the fading light, he could see she was younger than he'd initially thought, perhaps 22 or 23. Despite the dirt and exhaustion evident on her face, there was no missing her natural beauty. Long way from home, he commented, returning his attention to the lock. Brave of you to make such a journey alone. It didn't feel brave at the time, Pearl said with a small, rueful smile. Just necessary. My parents passed last year from influenza and there wasn't much left for me in Boston. The lock gave way with a soft click and the shackle around Pearl's right wrist fell open. She gasped, rubbing at the reddened skin beneath. One down, Beckett said with satisfaction, moving to the next one. By the time full darkness had fallen, Beckett had freed Pearl from all her shackles. She stretched her limbs gratefully, wincing at the soreness in her muscles. I can't thank you enough, Mr. Morgan, she said, her voice stronger now. Beckett, he corrected. And no thanks needed. No decent man would leave a lady in chains. He moved to the cave entrance again, listening intently. The night was quiet except for the occasional cry of a coyote in the distance. We should rest here tonight, he decided. Too dangerous to move in the dark, especially with those men still out there. Come morning, we'll figure a way to get you safely to Santa Fe. Pearl nodded, though Beckett could see the anxiety in her expression. Don't worry, he assured her. I've got a ranch about a day's ride from here. Once we make it there, we can send word to the marshal in Tucson about these outlaws. They settled in for the night, Beckett offering Pearl his worn duster as a makeshift blanket. The cave floor was hard and uncomfortable, but it was shelter and relative safety. Beckett positioned himself near the entrance, his Colt ready at his side. Get some sleep if you can, he told Pearl. I'll keep watch for a while. Pearl hesitated, then asked quietly, How did you come to be in that canyon? You said they were chasing you. Beckett nodded. Bad luck, mostly. I was heading home after selling some cattle when I stumbled on their camp. They've been after me since, figuring I saw too much, I suppose. Did you see too much? Beckett was silent for a moment. I saw a man's body, fresh killed and crates with U.S. Army markings. I reckon they're stealing government supplies, maybe weapons. That's worth killing over to men like them. Pearl shivered and pulled the duster tighter around her shoulders. Try to rest, Beckett said again, more gently. We've got a long day ahead tomorrow. As the night deepened, Beckett found himself watching Pearl's sleeping form more often than the darkness outside. Despite her ordeal, there was a strength in her that he admired. He'd met plenty of frontier women in his time, hardy souls who could work alongside any man, but Pearl Finley was different. A city woman with the courage to travel west alone, to build a new life from nothing. Something about that stirred him deeply. When the first gray light of dawn crept into the cave, Beckett gently woke Pearl. She startled at first, then relaxed when she recognized him. "Morning," he said softly. "I checked outside, no sign of them, but we should move quickly all the same." Pearl nodded, smoothing her tangled hair back from her face. "Which way?" "Up," Beckett answered, gesturing toward the back of the cave. "I found a passage last night while you were sleeping. It seems to lead upward, might take us to the top of the canyon. From there, we can get our bearings, maybe find my horse if he's still around." They set off through the narrow passage, Beckett leading the way. The path twisted upward through the rock, occasionally so tight they had to turn sideways to squeeze through. Pearl followed without complaint, though Beckett could hear her breathing hard with the exertion. After nearly an hour of climbing, they emerged onto the top of the canyon wall. The morning sun was fully up now, casting long shadows across the rugged landscape. Beckett scanned the horizon, getting his bearings. "There," he said, pointing to a distant line of trees. "That's Cottonwood Creek. My ranch is about 10 miles beyond it. If we can reach those trees by midday, we'll have water and shade for a rest." Pearl nodded, determination in her stance despite her obvious exhaustion. They set off across the rocky terrain, keeping to what cover they could find. Beckett kept a watchful eye on Pearl, slowing his pace when he noticed her struggling over the rough ground in her impractical city boots. "Here," he said after about an hour, offering his arm. "Terrain gets worse from here to the creek." Pearl hesitated only briefly before accepting his support. Her hand rested lightly on his forearm, warm even through the fabric of his shirt. Beckett tried not to think about how long it had been since he'd been this close to a woman. They walked in companionable silence for a while, the only sounds their footsteps and the occasional call of a hawk overhead. Finally, Pearl spoke. "May I ask about your ranch, Beckett? Is it large?" Beckett smiled slightly. "Not particularly. 160 acres, enough for a small herd of cattle and a few horses. I've got a decent cabin, a barn, and a good well. It's not much compared to some of the big spreads around here, but it's mine, free and clear." "You live there alone?" "Just me and my dog, Rusty. Had a ranch hand last season, but he moved on to California looking for gold." Beckett shrugged. "I manage well enough on my own most days." "It sounds wonderful," Pearl said softly, "to have a place that's truly yours." Beckett glanced at her, noting the wistful expression on her face. "The teaching position in Santa Fe, is that something you're looking forward to?" Pearl's steps slowed slightly. "It's an opportunity, the salary is fair, and they're providing housing. It's security, but not a dream." Beckett guessed. Pearl looked surprised, then thoughtful. "I haven't allowed myself many dreams lately. Survival has been more pressing." Before Beckett could respond, a movement in the distance caught his attention. He stopped abruptly, pulling Pearl behind a large boulder. "What is it?" She whispered, fear returning to her eyes. "Riders," Beckett said grimly. "2 of them headed this way." He peered around the edge of the boulder, assessing. The riders were still too distant to identify, but they were moving with purpose, following the faint trail he and Pearl had left in the dusty ground. "They've picked up our trail," he muttered. "We need to move faster, reach the creek where we can lose our tracks in the water." Pearl nodded, her face pale but resolute. They set off at a quicker pace, no longer taking time to obscure their trail. Speed was now more important than stealth. The creek was still a good 3 miles ahead, and the terrain offered little cover between here and there. As they hurried across the open ground, the sound of hoofbeats grew gradually louder behind them. Beckett risked a glance back and cursed under his breath. The riders had spotted them and were now galloping in pursuit. "Run," he urged Pearl, drawing his Colt. "Head for those rocks ahead." "I'll hold them off." "I won't leave you," Pearl insisted, breathless from their pace. "Pearl, please, no," she said firmly, her eyes flashing with determination. "I won't be left alone out here again." Beckett wanted to argue, but there was no time. The riders were closing fast, and the outcropping of rocks he'd spotted was their only chance for cover. Taking Pearl's hand, he pulled her along as they sprinted the last 100 yards to the shelter of the stones. They reached the rocks just as the first shots rang out, bullets pinging off the stone around them. Beckett pushed Pearl down behind the largest boulder, then took up a position where he could see their pursuers. 2 men, as he'd thought. One he recognized immediately as the man who'd called out to him in the canyon, tall, with a scraggly beard and a patch over one eye. The other was younger, barely more than a boy, but handling his rifle with practiced ease. "That's Ryder's brother," Pearl whispered, peering over Beckett's shoulder. "The younger one, they call him Kid." Beckett nodded, calculating their odds, 2 against 1, and he had only 3 bullets left. Not good. "We just need to hold them off long enough to think of something," he told Pearl, trying to sound more confident than he felt. The men had dismounted and were approaching cautiously, using the scattered rocks for cover. They were still calling to each other, not bothering to keep their voices down. "Morgan," the older man shouted, "we know you got our property with you. Send the woman out and maybe we'll let you walk away." Beckett didn't respond, watching as the men split up to flank their position. He couldn't keep an eye on both at once. "I need you to watch the left side," he told Pearl quietly. "Tell me if the younger one moves." Pearl nodded, her breathing quick but controlled as she peered around the edge of their shelter. "He's moving closer," she reported after a moment, using that tall rock with the flat top for cover. Beckett adjusted his position, trying to keep track of both men without exposing himself to their fire. The older outlaw fired again, the bullet striking uncomfortably close to Beckett's head. "You're just wasting bullets, Morgan," the man called. "Matter of time before we get you." Beckett glanced around desperately, looking for any advantage. The rocky ground offered little in the way of options, but about 20 yards to their right, a steep slope led down to what might be a dry creek bed. If they could reach it, they might be able to make a run for the cottonwoods, which were now visible in the distance. He was about to suggest this to Pearl when she suddenly gasped. "Beckett." "The boy is," her warning came just as the young outlaw appeared around the side of their boulder, rifle raised. Beckett fired instinctively, his bullet catching the youth in the shoulder. The boy cried out, dropping his weapon and stumbling backward. The older outlaw roared with anger, firing wildly in their direction. Using the distraction, Beckett grabbed Pearl's hand. "Now, run for that slope," he urged, pulling her to her feet. They sprinted across the open ground, bullets kicking up dust at their heels. Pearl stumbled once, but kept her footing as they reached the edge of the slope and half ran. Half slid down to the dry creek bed below. "Keep going," Beckett shouted, pushing Pearl ahead of him as they ran along the sandy bottom of the wash. Behind them, he could hear the outlaw shouting, presumably helping his wounded companion. They ran until their lungs burned, the cottonwood grove growing larger ahead of them. When they finally reached the trees, Pearl collapsed against the trunk of a large cottonwood, her chest heaving. Beckett stood guard, listening for sounds of pursuit, but the only noises were the rustle of leaves overhead and the bubbling of the creek that ran through the grove. "We lost them?" Pearl asked between breaths. "For now," Beckett confirmed, holstering his gun. "But they'll follow our trail eventually. We need to keep moving." Pearl nodded, pushing herself upright with visible effort. Her dress was torn in several places now, and a scrape on her cheek was bleeding slightly. Despite this, she squared her shoulders resolutely. "Lead on then," she said. Beckett couldn't help but admire her spirit. Many women and men, for that matter, would have broken under the strain of what she'd endured. Yet here she stood, ready to continue. They followed the creek for nearly a mile, walking in the shallow water to hide their tracks. The cottonwoods provided welcome shade from the increasingly hot sun, and both Beckett and Pearl drank deeply from the clear stream. Eventually, they emerged from the grove onto open grassland that stretched toward distant hills. "My ranch is just beyond those hills," Beckett said, pointing. "About 5 miles more. Think you can make it?" Pearl gave him a determined smile. "I've come this far, haven't I?" They set off across the grassland, moving at a steady pace. The day grew hotter, the sun beating down mercilessly. Beckett removed his vest, offering it to Pearl to shield her head and neck from the worst of the sun's rays. She accepted gratefully, fashioning it into a makeshift bonnet. As they walked, Beckett found himself telling Pearl about his life, how he'd come west at 17, worked as a cowhand on various ranches before saving enough to buy his own small spread 5 years ago. He told her about the harsh winter of '72 that had nearly wiped out his herd, and how he'd built it back up, one calf at a time. In turn, Pearl spoke of her life in Boston, her father's modest success as a bookbinder, and her mother's gentle insistence that Pearl receive a proper education unusual for a girl of her social standing. She described her brief career teaching at a small school in Boston, and how the loss of her parents had left her with few options but to seek employment elsewhere. "The school in Santa Fe wrote that they're desperate for qualified teachers," she explained. "The salary they offered would allow me to live independently, which is important to me." Beckett heard the unspoken implication that as an unmarried woman of 23 with no family, Pearl's options were severely limited. Many in her position would have sought marriage as a matter of survival, regardless of their own wishes. "It's admirable," he said sincerely. "Heading west on your own takes courage." Pearl looked away, a flush that wasn't entirely from the sun coloring her cheeks. "Or desperation," she said quietly. They crested a small rise, and Beckett pointed ahead with sudden excitement. "There, see that dust cloud? That's Rusty, my dog. He always kicks up a fuss when someone approaches the ranch." Sure enough, as they drew closer to the hills, a large red-brown dog came bounding toward them, barking enthusiastically. Behind him, visible now as they reached higher ground, stood a modest cabin with a barn and corral beside it. "Rusty," Beckett called, grinning as the dog reached them and circled excitedly, tail wagging so hard his whole body shook. "Good boy, keeping an eye on things." Pearl laughed as the dog turned his attention to her, sniffing curiously at her skirts before sitting politely at her feet, looking up with intelligent eyes. "He likes you," Beckett observed, scratching the dog's ears. "He's usually more cautious with strangers." "I'm honored," Pearl said, carefully extending her hand for Rusty to sniff before gently petting his head. "He's beautiful." They continued toward the ranch, Rusty trotting ahead and then circling back as if to hurry them along. As they approached, Beckett noticed with relief that his horse, a sturdy buckskin gelding, was grazing peacefully in the corral. "Looks like Thunder found his way home," he said. "Smart horse." The cabin was small but solidly built, with a covered porch across the front and a stone chimney at one end. A well-tended vegetable garden grew to one side, and several chickens scratched in a fenced yard nearby. It was humble, but it was clearly a home that had been created with care. "It's lovely," Pearl said sincerely as they approached. "So peaceful." Beckett felt an unexpected surge of pride at her words. He'd built most of this place with his own hands, working in the evenings after long days with the herd. It wasn't grand by any means, but seeing it through Pearl's eyes made him appreciate anew what he'd accomplished. "Let's get you inside," he said. "You must be exhausted." The interior of the cabin was simple but neat: one main room with a stone fireplace, a wooden table with 4 chairs, a small bookshelf filled with well-worn volumes, and a comfortable-looking armchair near the hearth. A curtained doorway at the back presumably led to a bedroom. Pearl sank gratefully into one of the chairs, while Beckett busied himself pumping water from the indoor pump, a luxury he'd installed just last year, and setting it to heat on the stove. "You should be able to wash up and rest," he told her. "I'll need to check on the cattle and make sure everything's secure in case those outlaws track us here." Pearl nodded, looking around the cabin with interest. May I help with anything? I'm not much of a cook, but I can manage basic meals. Rest first, Beckett insisted. There's a washtub behind that screen in the corner. I'll heat enough water for you to bathe, and there should be a clean shirt of mine you can use while your dress dries. It'll be big, but better than staying in those torn clothes. Pearl's eyes filled unexpectedly with tears. You're very kind, Beckett. I don't know how I'll ever repay you. Beckett shook his head, suddenly embarrassed. Anyone would do the same. No, Pearl said firmly. They wouldn't. You risked your life for a stranger. That's rare. Before Beckett could respond, Rusty's bark outside alerted them to someone approaching. Beckett moved quickly to the window, his hand going to his gun. Stay inside, he told Pearl, his voice tense, and take this. He handed her his rifle from its place near the door. Do you know how to use it? Pearl nodded, her face pale but resolute as she took the weapon. My father taught me, just in case. Beckett stepped onto the porch, Rusty at his side. The dog was alert but not aggressive, which suggested the visitor might not be a threat. Scanning the horizon, Beckett spotted a single rider approaching from the direction of town. As the figure drew closer, Beckett relaxed slightly. It was Walter Hayes, his nearest neighbor, whose ranch lay about 5 miles to the east. Beckett, Walter called as he rode into the yard. Thank the Lord you're all right. We've been worried sick. Beckett stepped off the porch to greet the older man as he dismounted. Walter was in his 60s, his weathered face creased with concern beneath his gray-streaked beard. What's happened, Walter? Beckett asked. Word came from Tucson that you never made it back from your cattle sale, Walter explained. Then yesterday, a military patrol found your wagon abandoned near Deadman's Pass with signs of trouble. We feared the worst. I ran into some outlaws, Beckett confirmed. Been on the run from them for days, just made it back here a short while ago. Walter's bushy eyebrows rose as he glanced toward the cabin. Alone, Beckett hesitated, then shook his head. No, I found a woman they'd kidnapped, Miss Pearl Finley. She was on her way to Santa Fe when they attacked her stagecoach. Walter whistled low. Is she all right? Shaken up, but strong. They had her in shackles, Walter, like an animal. Anger colored Beckett's voice at the memory. Savages, Walter muttered. Well, you should know the marshals organized a posse. They're searching the area between here and Tucson. If those outlaws are still around, they'll find them. This was welcome news. Beckett invited Walter inside to meet Pearl and share what information he had. The older man removed his hat respectfully as he entered the cabin, where Pearl stood nervously with the rifle still in her hands. Miss Finley, this is Walter Hayes, my neighbor, Beckett introduced them. Walter, Miss Pearl Finley. Madam, Walter said, nodding politely. Mighty glad to see you safe. Pearl set the rifle aside, her posture relaxing slightly. Thank you, Mr. Hayes. Beckett saved my life. Walter looked between them with interest, a knowing twinkle in his eye that made Beckett uncomfortable. After sharing what he knew about the marshal's search for the outlaws, Walter declined Beckett's offer of coffee. Should be getting back, he said. Emma will be wondering where I've got to, but I'll stop by tomorrow, make sure you're still doing all right. He paused, then added with deliberate casualness, Emma would be pleased to have company, Miss Finley, if you'd care to visit. Been a while since she's had another woman to talk to out here. Pearl smiled gratefully. I'd like that very much, Mr. Hayes, thank you. After Walter departed, Beckett resumed heating water for Pearl's bath. She watched him work, her expression thoughtful. Your neighbor seems kind, she observed. Walter and Emma are good people, Beckett agreed. Been out here 30 years, helped me a lot when I was getting started. He mentioned a posse looking for the outlaws, Pearl said hesitantly. Do you think they'll find them? Beckett considered this as he poured the heated water into the washtub behind the screen. Marshal Jenkins is thorough. If they're still in the territory, he'll track them down. Pearl nodded, but Beckett could see she wasn't entirely reassured. You're safe here, he told her gently. I promise you that. Something in his tone must have convinced her because Pearl's shoulders relaxed slightly. I believe you, she said simply. Beckett showed her where to find a clean shirt, and left her to bathe in privacy while he went to check on his livestock. The familiar routine of ranch work helped settle his thoughts, which had been in turmoil since finding Pearl in that cave. He'd never been one for impulsive decisions. Everything about his life had been carefully planned and worked for the ranch, the herd, his modest success. Yet in just 2 days, his orderly existence had been completely upended by the appearance of Pearl Finley. As he filled the water trough for his cattle, Beckett found himself thinking about Pearl's teaching position in Santa Fe. She would be leaving soon, continuing on her journey. The thought created an unexpected hollow feeling in his chest. By the time he returned to the cabin, the sun was beginning to set. He knocked before entering, calling out to make sure Pearl was decent. When she responded, he stepped inside to find her sitting in his armchair near the fire she'd lit, her damp hair falling in waves around her shoulders. She wore his white cotton shirt, which indeed engulfed her smaller frame, and her freshly washed dress was hanging near the stove to dry. The sight of her there in his home stirred something in Beckett that he wasn't prepared for. She looked right somehow, as if she belonged. "I hope you don't mind," Pearl said, gesturing to the fire. "The evening felt a bit cool." "Not at all," Beckett replied, hanging his hat on a peg by the door. "Are you hungry? I'm not much of a cook, but I can manage bacon and beans." Pearl smiled. "That sounds wonderful. And I'd be happy to help." They worked together, preparing the simple meal, moving around the small kitchen area with surprising ease, as if they'd done this many times before. Beckett found himself enjoying Pearl's company more than he'd expected. She was quick-witted and observant, asking intelligent questions about ranch life and sharing amusing stories of her teaching experiences in Boston. As they ate at the wooden table, Rusty lying contentedly at their feet, Beckett brought up the subject they'd both been avoiding. "Once we're sure those outlaws have been caught, I can take you to Santa Fe," he offered. "Make sure you arrive safely." Pearl's fork paused halfway to her mouth, her expression suddenly uncertain. "That's very kind of you," she said carefully, "but I wouldn't want to impose further." "It's no imposition," Beckett assured her. "I'd feel better knowing you reached your destination safely." Pearl set her fork down, her eyes meeting his across the table. "The truth is, Beckett, I'm not sure if I still want to go to Santa Fe." Beckett raised his eyebrows in surprise. "No." "But the teaching position would be safe," Pearl acknowledged, "secure, but these past days have made me question what I truly want." She took a deep breath as if gathering courage. "When those men took me, I thought I was going to die. And in those moments, I realized I've been living so cautiously, always doing what was expected rather than what might make me truly happy." "And what would make you happy, Pearl?" Beckett asked quietly. A flush colored her cheeks as she looked down at her plate. "I'm not entirely sure yet. But I know it involves more courage than I've shown before. More risk." The air between them seemed charged suddenly with unspoken possibilities. Beckett found himself wanting to reach across the table and take her hand, but he restrained himself. They'd known each other barely 2 days, after all. "Well," he said instead, keeping his tone light, "you're welcome to stay here as long as you need to figure things out. No rush to decide anything." Pearl's smile was grateful and perhaps a touch relieved. "Thank you, Beckett." After dinner, Beckett insisted that Pearl take the bedroom while he slept on a bedroll near the fireplace. Despite her protests that she didn't want to displace him, he was firm on this point. "I've slept under the stars plenty of times," he told her. "A wooden floor is luxury by comparison." As Pearl bid him good night and disappeared behind the bedroom curtain, Beckett settled onto his bedroll, Rusty curling up beside him. Sleep, however, proved elusive. His mind kept returning to Pearl, her courage, her intelligence, the way she'd looked sitting in his chair by the fire, as if she belonged there. It was madness, he told himself. They barely knew each other. Yet he couldn't deny the pull he felt toward her, stronger than anything he'd experienced before. Morning came with the crowing of his rooster, and the warm weight of Rusty still pressed against his side. Beckett rose quietly, trying not to disturb Pearl as he slipped outside to begin his morning chores. The early air was cool and fresh, the sky just beginning to lighten with dawn. He was in the barn, feeding his horses when he heard the cabin door open. Turning, he saw Pearl standing on the porch, still wearing his oversized shirt with her now dry dress over it like a makeshift robe. Her hair was loose around her shoulders, catching the first rays of sunlight. "Good morning," she called, walking toward the barn. "I hope I'm not disturbing you." "Not at all," Beckett replied, aware of how right she looked, standing there in the early morning light of his ranch. "Sleep well." "Better than I have in months," Pearl admitted, reaching out to stroke Thunder's nose as the horse stretched his head over the stall door. "He's beautiful." "He's stubborn is what he is," Beckett said with affection. "But he's a good horse. Do you ride, Pearl?" She shook her head ruefully. "Not since I was a girl. My father kept a horse for deliveries, and sometimes he'd let me ride with him." "I could teach you," Beckett offered, "if you'd like." Pearl's face lit up with interest. "I would like that very much." They spent the morning together, Beckett showing Pearl around the ranch while completing his necessary chores. She insisted on helping, gathering eggs from the chicken coop and helping to water the vegetable garden. By midday, they'd fallen into an easy rhythm together, working side by side as if they'd been doing so for years. After a simple lunch, Beckett made good on his promise to give Pearl a riding lesson. He saddled Thunder, who was his most gentle mount, and led him to an open area near the corral. "The key is confidence," he explained, helping Pearl onto the saddle. "Horses can sense fear, so even if you're nervous, try to project calm." Pearl nodded seriously, her hands gripping the saddle horn as she settled into position. Beckett adjusted her stirrups, trying to ignore the way his heart quickened when his hands brushed against her ankle. "Now, hold the reins like this," he demonstrated, standing close beside her. "Not too tight, just enough to communicate." Pearl followed his instructions with determination, her brow furrowed in concentration. Beckett led Thunder in a slow circle, one hand on the bridle, the other resting reassuringly on Pearl's leg to help her balance. "That's it," he encouraged as she began to relax into the rhythm of the horse's movement. "You're a natural, Pearl." Her delighted laugh when she finally took the reins herself, guiding Thunder in a slow walk around the yard, made something warm unfurl in Beckett's chest. She looked so alive, so free, nothing like the frightened woman he'd found in chains just days ago. They were so engrossed in the riding lesson that neither noticed the approach of riders until Rusty's bark alerted them. Beckett turned to see three men on horseback coming up the road to the ranch, the lead rider wearing the silver star of a marshal. "Looks like Marshal Jenkins," Beckett told Pearl, helping her dismount. "Let's see what news they bring." The marshal, a tall man with a neatly trimmed mustache and sharp eyes that missed little, greeted Beckett with a firm handshake. "Morgan," he nodded. "Good to see you in one piece, and this must be Miss Finley," he added, removing his hat politely. "Walter Hayes told us about your ordeal, madam." Pearl inclined her head. "Marshal, have you found the men who attacked us?" "We have," Jenkins confirmed, satisfaction evident in his tone. "Caught up to them this morning trying to sell army supplies in Wilcox, all four of them, including this rider fellow you described. They'll be facing a judge in Tucson by week's end." Relief washed over Pearl's face, and Beckett felt the tension he'd been carrying ease somewhat. "That's welcome news," he said. "Thank you, Marshal," Jenkins waved off his thanks. "Just doing my job, but there is one more matter." He reached into his saddlebag and withdrew an official-looking envelope. "This telegram came from Miss Finley. The school in Santa Fe has been trying to reach her, apparently." Pearl took the envelope with a murmured thanks, her expression suddenly guarded as she broke the seal and read the message inside. Beckett watched her face, trying to gauge her reaction, but her features gave little away. "Everything all right?" he asked quietly when she folded the paper and tucked it into her pocket. "Yes," she said, though her voice held a note of uncertainty. "The school is concerned about my delay. They're requesting I arrive within the week, or they'll need to offer the position to another candidate." The marshal and his deputies, after ensuring there was nothing more they needed, departed with promises to send word once the outlaws had been formally charged. As the dust from their horses settled, Beckett and Pearl stood in awkward silence, the telegram hanging between them like an unwelcome reminder of reality. "I suppose I should prepare to leave for Santa Fe," Pearl said finally, her voice carefully neutral. Beckett nodded, unable to articulate the sudden hollowness he felt at the thought of her departure. "I'll take you," he said. "As I promised." "Thank you," Pearl replied, not quite meeting his eyes. "You've been more than kind." They returned to the cabin, the easy companionship of the morning now strained. Pearl went to gather her few belongings while Beckett busied himself checking his saddlebags and supplies for the journey to Santa Fe. It would take 3 days of hard riding, he calculated. 3 days, and then she would be gone from his life. The thought hit him with unexpected force, stopping him in his tracks as he stood in the barn, Thunder's saddle in his hands. In just 2 days, Pearl had somehow woven herself into the fabric of his life, bringing warmth and light to places he hadn't even realized were cold and dark. The idea of returning to his solitary existence after taking her to Santa Fe suddenly seemed unbearable. Inside the cabin, Pearl was having similar thoughts as she folded the borrowed shirt that had been her nightdress. The telegram lay on the bed beside her, its words offering security and independence, everything she'd thought she wanted when she left Boston. Yet now, the prospect of teaching in Santa Fe felt hollow compared to the sense of belonging she'd found here, working alongside Beckett on his ranch. She'd never imagined herself as a rancher's wife, had, in fact, deliberately chosen a path that would allow her to remain independent. But Beckett wasn't like other men she'd known. He saw her strength, respected her mind. He'd saved her life and asked nothing in return, and somewhere between the cave and this cabin, she'd fallen in love with him. The realization should have frightened her, but instead it brought a sense of clarity. Pearl picked up the telegram, reading it one more time before making her decision. She found Beckett in the barn, methodically packing saddlebags for their journey. He looked up as she entered, his expression carefully composed. "I've been thinking," Pearl began, her heart pounding, "about Santa Fe." Beckett set down the bag he was holding, giving her his full attention. "And I've decided not to take the position," she said, the words rushing out before her courage failed her. "If that's all right." Confusion crossed Beckett's face. "Of course it's all right, but why? I thought this was what you wanted. Independence, security." Pearl took a step closer to him, her hands clasped tightly together to stop their trembling. "I've realized there are different kinds of security, different ways to be independent." She took a deep breath. "These past days with you, Beckett, working beside you, seeing how you live, it's shown me something I didn't know I was looking for." Hope flickered in Beckett's eyes, but he remained cautious. "And what's that?" "Partnership," Pearl said simply. "True independence isn't about being alone. It's about choosing who you share your life with." She looked down, suddenly uncertain. "I know we've known each other only briefly, and I've no right to assume." "Pearl," Beckett interrupted, closing the distance between them in 2 strides. His hands came up to cradle her face with infinite gentleness. "Are you saying you want to stay here with me?" The vulnerability in his eyes gave Pearl courage. "Yes," she whispered, "if you'll have me." For answer, Beckett lowered his head and kissed her, a kiss so tender and full of promise that Pearl felt tears spring to her eyes. When they parted, Beckett rested his forehead against hers, his hands still framing her face. "I think I've been waiting for you my whole life," he said quietly. "Didn't even know it until I found you." Pearl smiled through her tears, her heart fuller than she'd ever thought possible. "From shackles to freedom," she murmured, "and now to love. It's more than I dared hope for." They were married 2 weeks later in the small church in Tucson, with Walter and Emma Hayes as witnesses. Pearl wore a simple white dress that Emma had helped her make, and Beckett wore a new suit that made him look somewhat uncomfortable but undeniably handsome. Their life together began as it had in those first days, working side by side, building something meaningful together. Pearl discovered an aptitude for ranch life that surprised even her. She started a small school for the children of neighboring ranches, teaching 3 days a week in a room Beckett added to their cabin. When their first child was born a year later, a daughter with Beckett's blue eyes and Pearl's determined spirit, they named her Liberty. A fitting name, Pearl thought, for a child born of love that had broken through chains both literal and figurative. And on quiet evenings when the work was done and Liberty was asleep, Pearl and Beckett would sit together on their porch, watching the sun set over the land they both loved, their hands intertwined as they planned their future free together and completely their own.